Get your hands away from my daughter! Richard Collins' voice cracked across the intensive care unit like breaking steel. Every conversation died. Rubber soles froze against polished floors. The sharp scent of antiseptic hung beneath the bright white lights as dozens of frightened eyes turned toward Naomi Brooks, the black nurse standing beside the hospital bed with calm hands and steady breathing. Richard stepped between her and his unconscious daughter, his expensive charcoal suit still damp from the rain outside. His jaw tightened with disbelief. I will not let someone like you experiment on my family. A tray of medications slipped from Naomi's hands after his sudden movement. Plastic syringes rolled across the floor with tiny clicks that echoed through the silent hallway. Nobody bent down to help her. Nurses lowered their eyes. A security officer instinctively moved closer. Naomi slowly crouched, gathering every item one by one without saying a single word. Her fingers never trembled. Her eyes never met Richard's. Instead, they drifted toward the cardiac monitor. A soft electronic rhythm continued filling the room. Beep. 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 Something about that sound pulled at her instincts. She looked again. Just for a heartbeat. The rhythm was changing. Almost invisible. Almost impossible to notice unless someone had spent years watching children fight impossible illnesses. Sir, she said quietly, your daughter needs another evaluation before surgery. Richard laughed once. Cold. Sharp. Empty. You expect me to believe you over the best specialists in New York? Several executives standing behind him exchanged uncomfortable glances. They recognized Richard Collins immediately. Billionaire. Hospital donor. Chairman of one of the largest medical technology companies in America. His name was engraved on the building outside. His influence reached every office inside these walls. The chief surgeon cleared his throat carefully. Mr. Collins, we are on schedule. Richard nodded without taking his eyes off Naomi. Then remove her. Security took another step forward. Naomi remained exactly where she was. Not defiant. Not afraid. She looked only at the monitor again. The faint green line climbed. Fell. Climbed again. Too regular. Then, not regular anymore. A tiny hesitation. Barely half a second. Nobody else reacted. The surgeons continued reviewing charts beneath bright operating lights. Family members whispered near the doorway. Elevator bells chimed somewhere down the corridor. A wheelchair rolled past with squeaking wheels. Life continued around her. But Naomi felt something colder than fear settle inside her chest. She had seen this pattern once before during pediatric intensive care training years ago. One child survived. Another did not. The difference had been less than 60 seconds. Please, she said, her voice still gentle. Delay the procedure. Richard's face hardened. Enough. His polished shoes struck the floor as he closed the distance between them. You are finished here. Every nurse knew what came next. Someone would lose a job. Someone powerful would leave satisfied. Someone invisible would disappear without anyone asking why. Naomi lowered her eyes for a single moment, then reached into her pocket and quietly removed her hospital badge. She placed it on the nearby counter without protest. The room relaxed. Richard believed he had won. The chief surgeon exhaled softly. Security stepped back. Naomi turned toward the exit. But before she reached the automatic doors, the steady heartbeat echoing through the room suddenly changed. One long alarm shattered the silence. Every face snapped toward the monitor. The bright green line twisted into a pattern Naomi had feared from the very beginning, and the chief surgeon whispered words that instantly drained every trace of confidence from the billionaire's face. Wait, why is her rhythm collapsing? The shrill alarm ripped through the intensive care unit before anyone could move. The steady green heartbeat shattered into jagged spikes, and the calm confidence that had filled the room vanished in an instant. Doctors rushed toward the bed. Metal carts rattled across the polished floor. Fresh gloves snapped over trembling hands. Richard Collins stared at the monitor, as though money alone could force the numbers back into place. What is happening? He demanded. Nobody answered. The chief surgeon leaned closer to the screen, his forehead glistening beneath the surgical lights. Her blood pressure is dropping too fast. Richard looked around the room, expecting immediate solutions. Instead, he found uncertainty. The specialists who had spoken with perfect confidence, only moments earlier exchanged anxious glances. One nurse reached for another medication. Another checked the intravenous line twice. Nothing explained the sudden collapse. Near the automatic doors, Naomi Brooks had stopped walking. She never turned around. She simply listened. Every alarm carried a rhythm. Every rhythm told a story. This one felt painfully familiar. She closed her eyes for 1 second, remembering another hospital years ago. Another little girl. Another monitor. Another family that almost lost everything because everyone trusted the obvious diagnosis. Behind her, Richard's voice grew louder. Do something! The room erupted into controlled chaos. Shoes pounded against the tile. A portable ultrasound machine rolled into place. The monitor continued screaming. Then the chief surgeon's expression changed. He looked from the screen toward Naomi's abandoned badge resting quietly on the counter. A memory surfaced. During a conference months earlier, someone had presented an extremely rare pediatric cardiac complication that mimicked a routine surgical case. Only one intensive care nurse had identified it before disaster struck. He remembered the published report. He remembered the photograph attached to it. Slowly, his eyes lifted toward Naomi's back. Wait! His voice barely carried across the room. Miss Brooks. Naomi stopped. Every sound inside the intensive care unit suddenly felt distant. Richard spun toward the surgeon. Why are you talking to her? The surgeon ignored him. Did you recognize something before the alarms? Naomi finally turned. Her face remained calm, but exhaustion rested beneath her eyes like a shadow that had lived there for years. Her monitors showed electrical alternance, she answered softly. It began almost 2 minutes ago. Silence spread faster than panic. Several physicians looked back at the monitor. One resident rapidly reviewed the waveform. His expression drained of color. She is right. Richard frowned. What does that mean? Nobody answered immediately. The surgeon swallowed hard before speaking. If we had continued with the planned procedure. He stopped himself. The unfinished sentence felt heavier than any explanation. Richard stared from the monitor to Naomi, struggling to understand how the woman he had just dismissed could be the only person who had seen what an entire surgical team had missed. Can you help her? He asked, almost unwilling to hear himself ask the question. Naomi hesitated. She glanced toward the operating room where another emergency patient waited under her care schedule. Then she looked back at the frightened child lying beneath the white blankets. There is still time, she whispered. But only if everyone stops treating the wrong problem. The surgeon stepped aside without another word. It was the first time anyone had made room for her all morning. Richard watched it happen, unable to reconcile the image before him with the assumptions he had carried into the hospital. Naomi moved toward the bedside, her footsteps steady against the glossy floor. Every pair of eyes followed her. Even the alarms seemed to fade beneath the weight of the moment. She studied the monitor for only 3 seconds before quietly saying, Do not prepare the operating room. The chief surgeon blinked. Then where do we begin? Naomi slowly lifted her eyes to the latest scan displayed on the wall, and the instant she saw one tiny detail hidden in the image, her heart skipped. No, she whispered. This is not the disease everyone thinks she has. Naomi's words froze the room before anyone could breathe. This is not the disease everyone thinks she has. The giant monitor continued flashing urgent numbers across the dark screen, bathing every face in cold green light. The chief surgeon stepped closer, his heartbeat suddenly louder than the machine surrounding him. Richard Collins slammed his palm against the stainless steel counter. Enough riddles. Tell me what is wrong with my daughter. Naomi never looked at him. Her eyes remained locked on the skin glowing against the wall. A tiny shadow sat behind the child's heart, almost invisible beneath layers of overlapping images. Most people would have dismissed it as interference. Naomi could not. She had spent years studying cases that appeared only once in a generation. "Zoom in," she said quietly. A young radiology resident hesitated before adjusting the image. The room fell silent as the grainy blur sharpened one painful inch at a time. Suddenly, Naomi pointed toward a narrow crescent no larger than a fingernail. "There." The resident frowned. "I thought that was an artifact." Naomi slowly shook her head. "Artifacts do not move with each heartbeat." Every physician leaned closer. Reflections from the monitor danced across metal instruments and worried faces. Richard folded his arms, refusing to surrender control. "You are making guesses." Naomi finally turned toward him. Her voice stayed calm. "No. I am remembering." Those 4 words landed harder than anyone expected. She described a child from 6 years earlier whose symptoms looked almost identical. Surgeons had prepared the same operation. Another intensive care nurse had questioned the diagnosis. Nobody listened. The child never came home. The room grew painfully still. Even the air conditioning seemed quieter. The chief surgeon swallowed. He remembered reading that tragic case during his fellowship. He had never realized the nurse who wrote the warning report was standing only a few feet away. One resident searched the hospital database with trembling fingers. A photograph appeared beside an old clinical paper. Naomi Brooks. Pediatric Intensive Care Unit. Lead Clinical Observer. The resident whispered, almost to himself, "It is her." Richard's confidence cracked for the first time. He stared at Naomi, then back at the article glowing on the screen. Everything he believed about the woman standing before him began collapsing faster than his daughter's condition. Yet pride fought harder than fear. "If you are so certain," he snapped, "why has nobody heard your name?" Naomi answered without anger. "Because nurses rarely get remembered. Only mistakes do." Nobody spoke. Several nurses lowered their eyes, feeling every word. The chief surgeon stepped beside Naomi instead of in front of her. It was a small movement, but everyone noticed. "What do we do?" he asked. Naomi pointed toward the intravenous pump. "Stop preparing for surgery. Start preparing for pericardial decompression." Confusion swept across the room. One physician immediately objected. "That procedure could be catastrophic if the diagnosis is wrong." Naomi nodded once. "And surgery will almost certainly be catastrophic if I am right." Richard's breathing became shallow. His expensive watch reflected the harsh operating lights as seconds disappeared. He wanted certainty. Nobody could give it to him. Outside the glass walls, visitors began gathering. Someone quietly lifted a phone and started recording. Rumors spread through the hallway that the hospital chairman was arguing with a nurse while his daughter fought for her life. The pressure inside the room became unbearable. The chief surgeon looked at Richard. "We need your decision." Richard opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time in years, billions of dollars could not buy the right answer. Naomi took one careful step toward the bedside and gently reached for the girl's wrist. Her expression changed instantly. She felt something no monitor had shown. Her eyes widened just enough for the surgeon to notice. He leaned closer. "Naomi, what is it?" She looked directly at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "We are already too late, unless the person who caused this tells us the truth right now." The silence after Naomi's warning lasted less than a second before the room erupted again. "Who caused this?" the chief surgeon repeated, his voice cutting through the relentless alarms. Every monitor reflected across polished steel cabinets as frightened nurses exchanged uncertain glances. Richard Collins spun toward the medical team, anger replacing panic. "Nobody touched my daughter except your staff." Naomi did not answer immediately. She leaned closer to the unconscious girl, her fingertips hovering above the intravenous tubing without disturbing a single connection. Her eyes moved from the infusion pump to the medication label, then to the electronic chart glowing beside the bed. A tiny crease formed across her forehead. "This dosage was changed," she said quietly. One resident immediately shook his head. "Impossible. The orders came directly from the attending physician." Naomi looked at the timestamp instead of the resident. "The medication changed 8 minutes ago. The heart rhythm changed 6 minutes ago. Those two things are connected." The room became painfully still. The chief surgeon stepped toward the computer and rapidly opened the digital record. His eyes widened. The dosage adjustment was real. Nobody in the room remembered authorizing it. Richard slammed his hand against the counter again. "Find out who did it." Outside the glass walls, whispers spread through waiting families. More phones appeared. Tiny camera lights blinked on as people sensed something extraordinary unfolding inside the billionaire's private intensive care suite. Security officers moved closer, trying unsuccessfully to block the growing crowd. Naomi barely noticed them. Her attention never left the child. She listened to the uneven rhythm filling the room. Beep. Pause. Beep. The pauses were getting longer. She gently pressed 2 fingers against the girl's wrist, counting silently. Then she looked toward the infusion pump once more. "Stop it!" A senior physician frowned. "We cannot stop life support medication without confirmation." Naomi met his eyes for the first time. "It is not supporting her life anymore." Nobody moved. Years of hierarchy froze every hand in place. Richard's breathing grew heavier. "You expect me to gamble my daughter's life on your opinion?" Naomi answered without raising her voice. "No. I expect you to decide whether your pride matters more than another 60 seconds. The words landed harder than the alarms. Several nurses looked away. The chief surgeon stared at the monitor, then back at Naomi. Sweat gathered beneath his surgical cap. He knew hospital protocol. He also knew the protocol was failing right in front of him. Finally, he reached toward the pump. "Wait!" another physician shouted. "If we stop it and she crashes, every one of us is finished." Richard immediately pointed at Naomi. "Exactly. She will take responsibility." Naomi slowly shook her head. "No. I already accepted responsibility the moment I refused to ignore what everyone else missed." For one long heartbeat, nobody breathed. Then the chief surgeon switched off the infusion. The machine released a soft mechanical tone before falling silent. Every eye snapped toward the cardiac monitor. The jagged rhythm continued, then suddenly slowed, then flattened into an eerie, terrifying line. Gasps echoed across the room. Richard staggered backward as all color disappeared from his face. "What did you do?" he whispered. Someone outside the glass screamed. Even the physicians looked frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. A young nurse covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Richard turned toward Naomi with disbelief and fury burning together. "You killed her!" Security rushed forward again, footsteps pounding against the floor. Phones recorded every second. Naomi never stepped back. She kept her eyes fixed on the silent monitor, listening not to the machine, but to the child. Then, with complete calm, she reached beneath the girl's shoulder and gently adjusted her position by only a few inches. The flat line instantly broke. A single heartbeat flashed across the screen. Then another. The room froze in absolute disbelief. But Naomi's expression did not change. She stared at one tiny number that had just appeared in the corner of the monitor, and she whispered, almost to herself, "Someone has been hiding her real diagnosis from the very beginning." Naomi's whisper cut deeper than the alarms. "Someone has been hiding her real diagnosis from the very beginning." The words seemed to drain the oxygen from the intensive care unit. The monitor continued its fragile rhythm while the harsh fluorescent lights reflected across stainless steel instruments and sweat-covered faces. Richard Collins took one slow step forward, his voice shaking with disbelief. "What are you accusing my hospital of?" Naomi did not answer him. She reached for the electronic chart once more, scrolling through pages of laboratory results with calm, practiced hands. Every click echoed through the suffocating silence. Around them, Phones continued recording through the glass walls. Hospital employees gathered shoulder to shoulder. Several board members had already arrived, their polished shoes clicking sharply across the marble hallway before stopping outside the room. Nobody wanted to interrupt. Everyone wanted to witness what happened next. Naomi stopped on a single page. One laboratory value had disappeared from the final report. Her heartbeat quickened. She opened the archived history. There it was. The original result had been entered, then removed less than 15 minutes later. The chief surgeon leaned closer, his face turning pale. Who deleted that? A trembling resident searched the audit log. His fingers hesitated over the keyboard. Someone with executive authorization. Every eye slowly turned toward Richard. His expression hardened instantly. Do not look at me. The room grew even quieter. Richard looked toward the hospital administrator standing near the doorway. Explain this. The administrator swallowed hard. Only 3 people have executive access. Nobody moved. Naomi's voice remained almost painfully gentle. One of those people changed her treatment before anyone realized the diagnosis was wrong. Richard slammed both hands onto the counter. Metal vibrated beneath the impact. My daughter is dying and you are talking about paperwork? Naomi looked directly into his eyes for the first time. There was no fear left in hers. I am talking about the reason she is dying. Those words hit the room harder than any alarm. Even the investors outside the glass exchanged uneasy glances. The hospital carried Richard Collins' family name. If Naomi was right, this was no longer only a medical emergency. It threatened the reputation of one of the wealthiest healthcare empires in America. Security officers moved closer, unsure whether they were protecting the patient or protecting the institution. Richard's breathing became ragged. Remove her from this room. Nobody obeyed. The chief surgeon stood between Richard and Naomi without saying a word. That silent decision changed everything. Richard stared at him in disbelief. You are choosing a nurse over me? The surgeon answered quietly. I am choosing the person who has been right every single time today. A wave of whispers spread beyond the glass walls. Camera phones tilted upward. Reporters who had been covering another story inside the hospital noticed the gathering crowd and rushed toward the intensive care unit entrance. Tiny red recording lights multiplied in the hallway. Naomi ignored every lens pointed at her. She focused only on the child. Her fingers gently checked the girl's fingertips. They were warmer now. The heartbeat had stabilized slightly, but something still did not fit. She studied the medication bag hanging beside the bed. The label looked correct. The color looked correct. Then she noticed something almost invisible. The barcode sticker had been peeled away and replaced. Her pulse raced. Do not touch that bag, she said sharply. A nurse froze mid-step. The chief surgeon looked at Naomi. Why? She carefully held the bag against the bright operating light. Tiny air bubbles shimmered inside the clear fluid. Then she noticed an identification number that belonged to an entirely different patient. Her eyes widened. The room held its breath. Richard felt his knees weaken as Naomi slowly turned the bag toward everyone. This medication was never meant for your daughter. Nobody spoke. Nobody even blinked. The administrator's face lost every trace of color. A resident whispered, That cannot happen. Naomi looked toward the medication cabinet standing open across the room. One storage drawer was empty. One inventory seal had been broken. Then the cardiac monitor released another long warning tone, and before anyone could react, the chief surgeon stared at the latest blood pressure reading and whispered, Whoever switched that medication is still inside this hospital. The chief surgeon's words lingered in the cold air like smoke. Whoever switched that medication is still inside this hospital. No one answered. The alarm softened into a slow, fragile rhythm, each heartbeat stretching the silence tighter. Fluorescent lights shimmered across stainless steel rails and polished floors still scattered with unopened medical supplies. Beyond the glass, dozens of people stood motionless. The tiny recording lights on their phones glowed red, but no one spoke. Naomi Brooks remained beside the bed, her breathing slow and measured, as though the chaos surrounding her belonged to another world. Richard Collins could not take his eyes off her. Only minutes earlier he had tried to force her out of the room. Now every person inside it seemed to be waiting for her next sentence. The realization unsettled him more than the crisis itself. His hospital carried his family's name. His authority had always been absolute. Yet for the first time in decades, command had slipped quietly into someone else's hands without anyone announcing it. A phone vibrated somewhere in the hallway. Nobody reached for it. Even the security officers stopped shifting their weight. The entire floor seemed suspended between one heartbeat and the next. Naomi gently adjusted the blanket over the little girl without disturbing a single monitor cable. The child's breathing remained shallow, but steadier than before. Naomi closed her eyes for one brief moment, listening instead of looking. Machines could measure pressure. They could count heartbeats. They could never replace instinct earned beside hundreds of frightened children. She opened her eyes and looked toward the medication cabinet again. Everything felt wrong. Not chaotic. Deliberate. The chief surgeon followed her gaze. "You see something else?" Naomi nodded almost imperceptibly. "Someone wanted us to believe this was a medical failure." Richard's jaw tightened. "You are saying this was intentional?" Naomi answered carefully. "I am saying someone expected every one of us to stop asking questions." The words settled over the room with frightening weight. Several nurses exchanged uncertain looks. One quietly stepped toward the medication inventory terminal and stopped. She did not need to search. She already remembered something. Her eyes slowly widened before she whispered, "The cabinet was sealed when I started my shift." Another nurse turned immediately. "I checked it too." The chief surgeon looked from one nurse to the other. Neither appeared confused. They appeared afraid. Richard noticed it as well. Fear spread faster than panic because fear suggested knowledge. He stepped toward the administrator standing near the doorway. "Tell me what they are not saying." The administrator opened his mouth but no sound emerged. Sweat glistened along his temple beneath the harsh white lights. Outside the room, several board members quietly lowered their phones. Their confident expressions had disappeared. Investors who had arrived expecting a routine emergency now watched the hospital's leadership unravel without anyone raising a voice. Naomi walked slowly toward the electronic records station. Every step echoed against the polished floor. She entered one password after another until an archived staffing schedule appeared. Her eyes paused on a single name. She did not react. She simply read it again. The chief surgeon noticed the change in her expression. "What did you find?" Naomi did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward Richard. For the first time since he entered the intensive care unit, he lowered his eyes before she did. The silence between them carried more weight than any accusation. Finally, Naomi spoke. "The nurse assigned to this room this morning never checked in." Confusion rippled through the staff. "That cannot be right," someone whispered. Naomi pointed calmly at the schedule. "Her identification badge entered the building at 7:12 this morning." She tapped another screen. "But she never used it again." Richard frowned. "People forget to scan badges." Naomi slowly shook her head. "Not inside this hospital. Every secure door requires one." The room became impossibly still. Even the monitor seemed quieter. The chief surgeon leaned closer to the log, tracing the final recorded location with his finger. His breathing slowed. His face lost its remaining color. "This badge," he whispered. "Its last recorded access was not the intensive care unit." Naomi looked toward the elevator at the far end of the hallway, where a single light blinked above the closed doors. "No," she said softly. "It stopped one floor below us." At that exact moment, every phone in the intensive care unit received the same emergency security notification, and the elevator doors across the corridor slid silently open. The elevator doors slid open without a sound. Every head turned at once. The cold white light spilling from inside reflected across polished metal walls and frozen faces. No one stepped out. For one long heartbeat, the only sound was the soft pulse of the cardiac monitor behind Naomi Brooks. Then a hospital transport cart rolled slowly into view by itself, pushed only by the gentle slope of the floor. A forgotten identification badge rested on top. The entire hallway fell silent. The chief surgeon walked toward it carefully, his footsteps echoing through the corridor. Richard Collins remained frozen beside his daughter's bed, his expensive suit suddenly feeling heavier than armor. Naomi did not move. She watched the badge the way someone watches the final missing piece of a puzzle. The transport cart stopped naturally a few feet from the intensive care unit doors. The security officer picked up the badge and looked at the name. His eyes widened. "This belongs to Emily Carter." Several nurses gasped quietly. Emily was one of the most respected senior pediatric nurses in the hospital. She had not missed a shift in 12 years. "Where is she?" someone whispered. Nobody answered. Naomi extended her hand. "May I see it?" The officer hesitated, then placed the badge into her palm. She turned it over beneath the fluorescent lights. Tiny scratches surrounded the electronic chip. Fresh scratches. Someone had forced it open recently. Naomi looked toward the security supervisor. "This badge was cloned." Confusion spread instantly. Richard frowned. "Cloned?" Naomi nodded. "Someone copied her credentials." Whoever entered the medication room was never Emily. The hallway erupted with stunned whispers. Several board members exchanged alarmed looks. Investors who had arrived expecting a private medical emergency now watched a possible security breach unfold inside one of the country's most prestigious hospitals. Phones continued recording every second. Richard looked toward the administrator. "Tell me she is wrong." The administrator stared at the badge but could not speak. His silence answered before his words ever could. Naomi calmly handed the badge back. "Pull the security footage from 7 o'clock this morning." A technician standing near the doorway immediately opened the surveillance system. Dozens of cameras appeared across the screen. Hallways. Elevators. Medication rooms. Loading docks. Naomi stepped closer. "Camera 12. The technician clicked. Grainy footage appeared. Emily Carter entered the employee entrance carrying her coffee exactly on schedule. She smiled at another nurse before disappearing around the corner. Naomi pointed toward the timestamp. "Keep going." The footage advanced. 7 minutes later, another person wearing Emily's identification badge appeared on screen. The hood of a hospital jacket hid most of the face. The posture was different. The walk was different. The right hand remained inside the pocket the entire time. Naomi quietly said, "Freeze it." The image stopped. Every eye focused on the figure. Richard leaned closer to the screen. "Can anyone identify this person?" Nobody answered. Then Naomi noticed something almost invisible. The hood shifted slightly as the person reached for a secured door. A silver cuff link caught the overhead light for less than a second. Naomi's breathing slowed. "Zoom in." The technician enlarged the image until the pixels nearly broke apart. The cuff link carried a tiny engraved symbol. The chief surgeon suddenly inhaled sharply. He recognized it immediately. So did 2 board members standing behind him. Richard looked from one face to another. "What is it?" Nobody wanted to answer. Finally the chief surgeon spoke, barely above a whisper. "Those cuff links are custom made." Richard frowned. "For whom?" The surgeon slowly turned toward the hospital administrator, whose face had become almost completely colorless. "Only members of the executive board received them." Every phone lowered at once. The whispers disappeared. For the first time that day, every pair of eyes moved away from Naomi Brooks and toward the people who had stood at the top of the hospital's hierarchy. Richard looked at the administrator, as though seeing him for the first time. The administrator took one slow step backward. Then another. Naomi never raised her voice. "Do not let him leave." Before security could react, the administrator reached into his jacket, pulled out his own executive identification badge, and let it fall onto the polished floor with a sharp metallic click that echoed through the silent hallway. The executive identification badge struck the polished floor with a sharp metallic echo that no one dared interrupt. Every phone remained raised, but the crowd stopped whispering. Even the security officers hesitated before taking another step. The administrator stared at the badge lying between his polished shoes as though it no longer belonged to him. Under the cold fluorescent lights, the symbol of authority suddenly looked painfully small. Richard Collins followed it with his eyes, then slowly looked up at Naomi Brooks. For the first time since he had entered the intensive care unit, he could not find a single word to challenge her. Behind them, the cardiac monitor continued its steady rhythm. No alarms. No frantic shouting. Only the quiet pulse of a child who was finally holding on. The silence carried more weight than every argument that had filled the room that morning. The chief surgeon carefully picked up the badge without breaking eye contact with the administrator. "Security," he said quietly. "Please remain with him until internal investigators arrive." Nobody resisted. The administrator lowered his head and allowed the officers to guide him toward the hallway. Every camera followed him for only a moment before turning back toward Naomi. She had become the center of the room without ever asking for attention. Her hands were still adjusting the blanket around the little girl, smoothing one small fold near the child's shoulder with the same quiet care she had shown before anyone believed her. One of the younger nurses stepped closer, her voice barely audible. "I should have listened to you." Naomi smiled gently without looking away from the patient. "You were trying to help." The young nurse's eyes filled with tears anyway. Across the room, another physician slowly removed his surgical gloves and placed them on the counter. "I read your pediatric case study years ago," he admitted softly. "I never realized you were the nurse who wrote it." Naomi offered only a small nod. She did not defend herself. She did not remind anyone that she had been right. She simply checked the child's pulse again. Richard watched every movement in silence. His shoulders, once held perfectly straight by habit and confidence, now seemed impossibly heavy. The reflection of the overhead lights trembled faintly across his eyes. He remembered the tray of medication striking the floor. He remembered the words he had spoken in anger. He remembered ordering security to remove the woman who had quietly saved his daughter's life. None of those memories would leave him now. He took one cautious step toward Naomi. Several board members instinctively moved aside, creating a clear path without anyone asking. The same executives who had ignored her only an hour earlier now waited respectfully for her to finish caring for the patient before approaching. Richard stopped beside the bed, keeping a careful distance. His voice had lost every trace of authority. "Miss Brooks." He paused. The title felt strangely inadequate. "Naomi." She looked at him calmly. There was no triumph in her expression. No resentment. Only exhaustion after carrying a burden no one else had been willing to see. Richard lowered his eyes. The movement was almost imperceptible, yet everyone in the room noticed it. The billionaire who had built hospitals, negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions, and commanded boardrooms around the world could not meet the gaze of the nurse he had humiliated. "I was wrong," he said quietly. The words barely rose above the hum of the ventilation system, but they reached every corner of the room. Nobody moved. Nobody looked away. Several employees who had witnessed the confrontation that morning felt tears gathering without understanding why. It was not simply an apology. It was the collapse of an assumption that had shaped the entire day. Naomi answered with the same calm voice she had carried from the beginning. "Right now, your daughter needs her father more than she needs anyone to win an argument." Richard looked toward the bed. His daughter's fingers moved ever so slightly beneath the blanket. His breath caught. The chief surgeon smiled for the first time all day. Around them, the atmosphere softened as fear slowly gave way to hope. Yet Naomi's eyes drifted toward the intensive care unit window, where investigators were already entering the hallway. She noticed one detective holding a sealed evidence bag containing the switched medication. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. The child had been saved, But whoever planned this had not acted alone. As the detective quietly lifted another unopened hospital file from the evidence box and looked directly toward Naomi, she realized this story had never been about a single patient. The detective held the sealed evidence bag without saying a word. Morning light had begun slipping through the tall hospital windows, washing away the harsh glare that had filled the intensive care unit all night. The stainless steel rails no longer looked cold. The machines no longer screamed. Only the quiet, steady rhythm of a healthy heartbeat remained, filling the room with a fragile peace that nobody wanted to disturb. Naomi Brooks checked the little girl's pulse one last time before gently tucking the blanket beneath her shoulder. The child breathed evenly now, her small fingers curling instinctively around the edge of the sheet. Naomi smiled almost imperceptibly, then stepped back. She did not wait for applause. She did not look toward the cameras still pointed at her. She simply reached for the medication tray she had dropped hours earlier. One by one, she collected the last unopened syringe, the last gauze pad, the last forgotten wrapper that everyone else had stepped around during the chaos. Richard Collins watched in silence. He had spent a lifetime believing greatness announced itself through titles, wealth, and power. Yet the strongest person he had ever met was quietly cleaning a tray no one else had noticed. His daughter stirred softly against the pillow. Her eyes opened for the first time. "Dad?" she whispered. Richard rushed to her bedside, his composure finally breaking. He took her hand carefully, afraid even gratitude might be too loud for the moment. Tears gathered before he could hide them. He looked over his shoulder toward Naomi, but she had already turned to leave. "Naomi," he called gently. She stopped at the doorway without turning around immediately. The hallway behind her had become almost completely silent. Employees lowered their phones. Reporters let their cameras rest at their sides. Even the detectives paused. Richard walked across the room until he stood a respectful distance behind her. His expensive shoes echoed softly against the polished floor, but they no longer sounded like footsteps of authority. They sounded like a father trying to catch up with a truth he should have seen much sooner. "I cannot erase what I said," he admitted quietly. "I cannot undo what I believed." Naomi looked at him with calm eyes that carried neither anger nor triumph. Richard continued, his voice steady despite the emotion pressing against every word. "But because of you, my daughter still has a future." The silence that followed felt deeper than any speech. Naomi answered with a gentle smile. "Then spend that future teaching her to see people before she sees anything else." Richard lowered his head. There was nothing left to defend. Nothing left to buy. Nothing left to prove. Only something left to learn. The chief surgeon quietly removed the temporary suspension notice that still rested on the counter. Without ceremony, he folded it once and placed it into the shredder beside the nurse's station. The soft sound of paper disappearing seemed to erase more than ink. One by one, nurses who had avoided Naomi's eyes earlier that morning now nodded respectfully as she walked past. Some smiled through tears. Others simply stepped aside, making room for her in the hallway. Nobody asked for photographs. Nobody offered dramatic speeches. Respect had finally become silent. Outside the hospital, the first golden sunlight reflected across the glass entrance where Richard's family name was carved into polished stone. He looked at it for a long moment before turning back toward the lobby. "Change it," he said quietly to a board member standing beside him. The man looked confused. Richard glanced toward the intensive care unit where Naomi had already disappeared around the corner. "Names on buildings matter less than the people inside them." Hours later, Naomi walked through the employee exit carrying the same worn lunch bag she had brought to work before sunrise. The morning air felt cool against her face. Birds crossed the bright sky above the parking lot. Behind her, the hospital doors opened again, but she did not look back. She simply continued toward her old car with the same steady pace she had carried through every insult, every accusation, and every impossible decision. Inside the hospital, a father held his daughter's hand with gratitude instead of pride. Outside, a nurse walked quietly into the new day. The sunlight followed her shadow across the pavement, and for the first time that morning, no one saw a black nurse. They saw the woman who had carried compassion where power had failed.